Hello everyone. So the last thing we have talked about in our previous video was integration of Blade, and we created some views to support that Blade engine, and we created some layouts, and we created some views to extend the layout. So we had the login page. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit of Bootstrap features to set up our login page. So this guy right here needs to be in the center. We're going to be using offset here. So the Bootstrap automatically comes with 12 column grid system as a default. So what this offers us is that we can use column like this right next to each other up to 12. What I want to do is that I want to make my column 6 column wide, and I want it to be centered. So this is what offset comes in play, and I'm going to call in the offset of 3. What offset does is that offset always occurs on the left side, so it will put a 3 column wide invisible column so that our login page would look like centered. I'm gonna apply this to, let's see if it looks responsive. You wouldn't have to worry about it. It looks quite well. Don't have to change anything. So I'm going to modify this to call ID, like this, and ID, it's like short for identification, and we're going to get password. And since this is the required autofocus, let's modify this real quick. ID, we're going to name this, I'll name it ID, and this doesn't have a name. I'll name this password, and these two right here, ID field, and these two right here be password field. Okay, this is it for the login page. Now let's create our session system. For that, I'll create a new helper class library. Oops. Space libs. I'll go down and define my properties. Protected user, protected logged out. I'll give it false. If it is logged out, do not give me anything, just returns null. I can do this as well. If this user is not null, return this user. So this guy right here is only responsible of giving me just the return type user session info from DB. And what guest does is that guest is pretty much a shortcut for this check method, and that's about it. We will skip the attempt for now and go into the check and check. What check does is that is null. If this user is null, return true. That means user is not set. True. Return. If user is not set, return true. Well, I'll reverse that. If the user is set, what this means, if user is set, return true. Otherwise, return false. So check returns false if user is logged in, and it will return user information. No, it will only return boolean. And then we'll look at some ID code. How to get the ID is if this session, well, this session is not defined anywhere in this file, but this guy needs to come from the services. So we're actually using this session and the session adapter. And what needs to happen is that I'm going to get the session. I'm going to check if it has this session key. And this session key is going to be our prefix holding our session key, the session key, which we define our user ID. So it will look for the session ID. If the user has a set user ID, then this returns true. And if it returns true, return this session again. Get session key. Boom. If user key is not defined, return null. Oh, sorry. This is in the wrong place. This is supposed to be in the ID. My mistake. And then we'll jump into the login. So login needs to get a user. This is actually a model. If user false, what do I want to say? False. This regenerate session ID. This session set. This session key as a key and user ID. So what happens is that it gets it gets the user model, and if we have the user model, we'll continue. If we don't, which returns false, and return false as a login. But if we do, then we log the user's ID to this key. And let's look at the session key now. For the session key, I define the session key in the controller's config. In the config, what I do is that I create session equals array, and this array will have an ID session no user ID. So this will be our key. And we can change, we can just come up here and change it if we really want to change anything. This makes it easy to modify our application. So this will only return this session make sure this time I'm using config, reaching the session array, and reaching its ID, which returns session ID, user ID. Let's say returns user ID. Ugh. Okay, next thing is that I'm going to oh my bad, think in Turkish again. Find first, which receives an ID from here. So what this does is that I give it an ID, it returns the user from that model, which I could set this as a property here, so I wouldn't go down to change it if anything changes throughout my application, but I'll just leave it for now. And for session generator, regenerate ID, just retrieve session regenerate ID. Yep. And retrieve key. Did I not do this? Retrieve key. Oh, retrieve key is the same thing as session key, so I really don't need to do that. Retrieve by ID. This returns the user model found within the ID. And what this does is that it regenerates session token to prevent session hacking. And there's two of these. You can either give this a user model or you can just give it an ID. And what this does, it actually uses this login and ready to give the user model, which is equal to this retrieve by ID, and we give it its ID. So this returns the model to our login method above, and it gets the user model, checks if any user is found within that ID. If it is, then it regenerates the session token and then sets its session. Pretty easy. And then we're going to look at the logout one. And for logout, basically we'll come here inside user. Hey, you just become null. This logged out equals false. Nope, true, it was already false. This session destroy, and this guy right here is using the session over here, which has a method of destroy. So we got a guest. Okay, we don't have the attempt, so attempt is a little tricky. Attempt is actually pretty much the only method we're going to be using to accomplish the authentication. So what attempt will get is that it will get an array, and it will be a credentials. Let's call credentials, which holds an array. And what I would like to do is that when I receive these conditions, I want to do a few things. Okay, so before I start writing this function, let's actually set up everything within the database. I'll go to my Navicat. And in here, I'll create one database called project1. Default is UTF Unicode, and I'll make this one. We can just do Unicode, but I prefer this one better. I'll just create one table and type integer 12 primary key auto increment, go one below, and call this. I'll just give this a username of students. Yep, of course. This is also gonna be an integer of 12, and also I'll have a password. Varchar. This is how it should work pretty much. ID, username, password. I'll make this TC for short. It will only receive numbers, and this can be both. And that's pretty much it. And then I'll go to here. Username is root. DB name is the project1. It doesn't have any password. That should be about it. And then I'll leave it as it is. Okay, now I will create my user model. So project 1 Falcon, and I'll just do model. Create some model. Table name. Let's see. Models namespace. Schema. What about all models? What does that say? 28. There's a mistake. There's a problem. Syntax error. Yep, there is one. Indeed. We got Auth student successfully created. Go into our model directory. What I will do, I'll rename this short for user. It's easy. And now I'll keep this, but I'll change this one. User. It will not hurt any of your system and its components. It's already changed. And now I'll test this user out in one of my controllers, which is index controller. I'll comment this, and then I'll go ahead and okay. So this is how you do it. Find first gets only one array, and inside this array we'll have two params. The second one is a bint with an array, and the first one is our query. So we're going to ask tc if tc is equal to tc and password equals password. So in PhalconPHP, this part is pretty much like a variable. So these variables will be assigned in the bin section. So this is how we assign them. tc equals, let's say 1. Say 1 is an integer. And then password will be equal to ABC. And if we get a result, say user ID is that, and then we'll say user. I'm missing this, yep. And then we created a junk data 1 ABC. So if you refresh, it finds 1. Let's say if we say AC, what does it find? It finds nothing. So now I'm going to apply this into my attempt directory right here. So this credential part is just about right. This is exactly the same as credentials, so I'll paste this over here. But what's wrong is that I somehow need to produce this line with the given credential. So what I would like to do is that I would create condition, and this would be created by to-where condition passing credentials. Are they identical? No, now they are identical. To-where conditions. Let's create it in one below. Public function to-where condition which receives just paste this. Now this will be only responsible of returning this line of code, but whatever the keys are has to be the same as the given. So what I will do is I'll start with a count equals, and then I'll make a counter equals 1. And then I'll go ahead and for each credentials as key value equals key equals dot key dot, yeah, this should give me the exact same. So the key is this, and then it gets equal sign, and this exact same keyed stuff, and the structure looks right. But what needs to happen is that if it is the last item, it should check count credential. I don't know how to spell this, but I'll make it identical. Count if the I is less than the total of credentials, then count equals and what I do is I increment I. That's it, and then return count. Now this should work. Let's give it a try. We'll return this and attempt. I'll just give it a try over here. And how would that work is libs Auth I have to I have to instantiate this. Let's do that. As a new, then go down and say how attempt, and our array password. And this should be print art. Line 25, there's a mistake. What does it say? Unexpected user variable. Since we didn't do any kind of checkings, it's normal to queue that. I didn't debug any of this code here, so it's okay. So what does it say? Unexpected. There we go. It's exactly the right way. So that we have this, what I can do is just replace this with condition and return user. Lips user not found because we're not in the same namespace. Okay. This is an indication that it didn't find anything. But if I say ABC, it finds the user within these credentials. So this is how our authentication system will work. And what I will do is that if user false, this login using ID user ID and return true, indication that attempt method returns successful, else return false, which attempt fails. This login using ID, so we send it down to here, which it gets the ID from retrieve by ID and sends it to login, which it gets the model, regenerates session ID and sets the token for us. Now I can do auth user and receive this user. Let's actually log a user in. Auth session. Okay, we cannot get the session inside here, inside the auth. What we need to do is that we need to extend injector and we need to use Falcon DI injectable as injector. Let's check it one more time. Access the undefined property config. Yep, we can't access it at all. Is that because we don't have one? Seems like we don't. Okay, we'll define one. You can just config, and what we need to do, config, because config is already available, like we used over here. What I need to do is use config inside of this closure. Now we got one. And we successfully logged the user in. Now what we need to do is that I logged in, so what I need to do is auth user and just get the user information. Why can I not get it? Since I got it. Returns null. That's because we couldn't write the session, because it didn't work in a second ago. Now I'm attempting the guy. Just logs in, and then since we have the session of it, oh, I have no idea why this doesn't work. Okay, so here I'll make some tests for session key, login using ID, check, and user. I cannot get any of the information. So I found out that in this login using ID, I forgot to return the user. So everything returns, not this, returns something. And if I look at the login doesn't return anything but just sets a session. And if I go up, logout doesn't return anything, and check returns, yep. And if I look at the attempt, it looks about right. And however, the user is not enough. So what needs to happen here is that this session has this session key. I get the ID, this session, get this session key. Else ID would have been null. ID equals null. So what happens here is that if we get any session key, what session key returns is the user ID. Session key returns user ID from config, this guy, and user ID goes back to here, and we're checking the session if anything is defined based on the key user ID, and true returns, then we get it. So what we get is the ID of the user. ID of the user from DB. And if we can't get it, then we set it null. In this case, when we go back to here, we should able to get the user. But what if we delete this line, indicating that there's no login or attempt anything occurs? We just need to call the user from session. We still cannot get it. I don't know why. We already attempted the user in. Oh, that's weird. Pretty weird. If I do this, I still can't get the user. I don't know why, but I have a theory that if I make a service like this and go to the, just define this guy right there instead of this guy right here, it should be this return auth, and this will be turned into auth. Now it's a singleton because there's a set shared. Let's make it true. And going back to index controller, now we'll reach the auth like this. What? Oh, set share didn't have that. Only set does have that. It's still giving me null. Still does. Somehow it is having a problem. So looking into here, and if we can't still get the user, what we need to do is move if the ID is not null. This user equals retrieve by ID. Retrieve ID. And this is where I set the user. This user. And it works. Now it works from the session. We got it solved. Now we can call this anywhere in our application, this auth user, and we can reach the logged in user, and we can use any of the methods we wrote in this class. For example, we can get whether user is logged in or not, or we can just say if user is guest or not. One thing about guest is that it's the reverse. And that seems about right. So if I need to user ID, I can just do that. So that's about it. I'll just log out my user over here. Let's say log out.
I hope you find this video useful. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. See you in the next video.